I still remember how it all started, although now these memories look like pieces of broken glass, sharp, jagged, digging into my mind with every attempt to put them back together. My name is David, and I've never been what you'd call a lucky guy. Working in a warehouse that always stinks of engine oil and sweat ate up my days, leaving only fatigue and emptiness. Things were no better at home. My wife, Emily, had become estranged after 10 years of marriage, and my son, Zack, who turned 16, looked at me as if I were a stranger who had accidentally wandered into their lives. We lived under the same roof, but each of us was an island surrounded by silence. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to get back what we lost, at least for a couple of days. So I suggested that we go to the old family house by the lake for the weekend, the place where we used to laugh, roast marshmallows over a campfire, and pretend everything was okay. Emily agreed without much enthusiasm, and Zack rolled his eyes but nodded. I thought it was a chance. I was wrong. It was a long trip there. The road wound through endless fields where the wind bent the dry grass and the horizon seemed to be a blur. The car was humming, the tires were rustling on the asphalt, and I was trying to get them to talk. Emily answered briefly, looking out the window, and Zack sat in the back, buried in his phone, headphones in his ears. I felt like an idiot, but I kept talking about how we were going to fish, how I was going to teach him how to make a fire. He didn't react. When we finally turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was already setting, flooding everything with crimson light. The house stood at the water's edge, an old one with peeling paint and a sagging porch. It was quiet around him, except for the wind rustling in the trees and the water lapping against the shore. I unloaded the bags, trying not to notice how Emily grimaced when she saw a spider web in the corner, and Zack muttered something about the lack of Wi-Fi. The evening went badly. I tried to light the fireplace, but the wood was damp and smoke filled the room, making us cough. Emily said she was tired and went to sleep in the upstairs bedroom. Zack sat on the couch, flipping through something on his phone until the battery ran out, and then just stared at the wall. I felt like everything was falling apart, but I didn't give up. I offered to play cards, but he refused. I asked if I wanted to go for a walk to the lake, and he snorted. In the end, I spat and went to the kitchen to make coffee. There I found an old radio receiver, dusty with a cracked case. I turned it on, turned the knob, and snatches of music, voices, and noise made their way through the crackle. It was better than silence. I left him to work and went back to Zack, but he had already gone to his room. I was left alone with the radio hissing and a mug of cold coffee, thinking that tomorrow would be better. The next day, everything went wrong. In the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Emily was still asleep, and so was Zack, but I was sure someone was walking outside. I looked out the window, but there was no one there. Only the wind was blowing the leaves on the ground. I went out to check, walked around the house, looked under the porch. It was empty. But at the barn, which stood a dozen meters from the house, the door was ajar. I definitely remembered locking it yesterday. He came closer and pushed the door open. It smelled damp and sour like rotten meat. There were rusty tools, coils of rope, and empty gasoline cans on the floor. Nothing unusual, but the feeling that I was being watched wouldn't let go. I returned to the house, deciding not to tell Emily about it. She would only get mad that I was being paranoid. The day passed slowly. I tried to persuade Zack to go fishing, but he said he was sick of the smell of water and stayed inside. Emily was sitting on the porch with a book, ignoring my attempts to speak. By lunchtime, I decided to do something useful and went to fix an old boat off the shore. While I was tinkering with the paddle, I heard a crackling in the bushes. I turned around and there was no one there again. But a minute later, two men came out of the woods. A man in his 40s tall with a thick beard and a scar across his eyebrow, and a younger guy, thin, with nervous eyes. They were both wearing shabby clothes and carrying backpacks. They said they were lost and asked for directions to the highway. I explained, showed them the direction, but something in their behavior bothered me. The bearded man stared into my eyes for too long, and the thin one kept looking around as if he was waiting for someone. They left, but I noticed the bearded man glance at the cabin before disappearing behind the trees. By evening, I was already regretting that I had dragged us here. Emily and Zack locked themselves in their rooms again, and I sat by the fireplace, listening to the radio hissing with static. Then it picked up a signal, a man's voice, calm but firm, talking about the weather, that it would rain at night. I turned off the radio, but the words stuck in my head. The rain started an hour later, heavy, with gusts of wind drumming on the roof. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling until I heard sound. The creaking of floorboards downstairs is quiet but distinct. I got up, took a flashlight, and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but the window I'd been closing was now wide open. The wind blew raindrops inside, and they dripped down the windowsill, leaving dark spots. I came closer and froze. Someone had left a mark on the glass, a dirty handprint too big to be mine. My heart started pounding, but I told myself that it was the wind that I was making up. I closed the window, checked the doors, and everything was locked. I went back to the bedroom, but I couldn't sleep anymore. In the morning, Emily noticed that her bag was rummaged through. Nothing was missing, but things were not as she had left them. Zack said he heard footsteps at night, but he thought it was me. I didn't mention the window because I didn't want to panic. I decided that we would leave tomorrow if things didn't work out. But the day brought new surprises. While I was fixing the porch, I noticed that the barn was open again. It was worse inside than yesterday. Cans of gasoline were overturned, ropes were unwound, and the word "look" was scrawled on the wall. The letters were crooked, carved with something sharp. I felt my stomach clench. It wasn't an accident. Someone was here. Someone was playing with us. It started raining harder in the evening, so I decided to talk to Emily. She sat by the fireplace, staring into the fire, and listened to me in silence. When I finished, she said it was nonsense, that I was thinking too much. But her voice was shaking, and I could see her hands clenching. Zack came downstairs when he heard us, and for the first time over the weekend, he looked at me with something like concern. I said we were leaving in the morning, and no one argued. The night passed uneasily. I dozed fitfully, listening to every rustle. The radio, which I had left turned off, suddenly turned on by itself. A voice broke through the crackle, the same as yesterday, but now he was speaking. "Don't go away. It's not the time yet." I pulled the power cord out of the socket, but the words echoed in my head. The morning was gray, wet, and cold. I packed up while Emily and Zack were finishing breakfast. The car was parked by the porch, and I could already picture us driving out onto the highway, leaving this damn house behind. But when I opened the door to load the bags, everything changed. There was an old knife on the doorstep, with a rusty blade and a wooden handle stained with something dark. I froze, looking at him, and then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, and Emily was standing in the doorway, her face white. Zack peeked over her shoulder, and I saw his eyes widen. That's when I realized something was starting. And it won't end just like that. The rain was lashing the roof, turning the ground around the house into a swamp. I lifted the knife, feeling the cold metal even through my glove. Emily grabbed Zack's arm, pulling him back into the house. Her eyes darted between me and the darkness outside the door. "Close the door." I shouted, but she was already doing it, turning the key with trembling hands. I stayed on the porch, a flashlight in one hand, a knife in the other. The light picked out a strip of wet grass, a sagging barn, and the black silhouettes of trees. No one, but someone was here. Someone was watching. Zack's voice came from the other side of the door, muffled. "Shut up." I cut him off abruptly. His brain was racing. The car was 20 meters away, the keys in his pocket. If we run now, will we make it? Or are they already waiting by the car? A step to the right, a branch crunches. I jerked the flashlight in that direction. The light shone on his face. The same bearded man who came in the afternoon. He stood there grinning, hands in his jacket pockets. A thin man loomed behind him, clutching a tire iron in his hand. "Go away," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice faltered. The bearded man laughed. "Do you think this is your house?" He took a step forward. "We've been here a long time. We watch how the city people come and play with a happy family. And then..." He clicked his tongue. "Then they cry." The thin man fidgeted, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. His eyes were glittering feverishly. "Are you crazy?" I raised the knife higher. "The police are on their way." "No," the bearded man shook his head. "Your connection is not working. We took care of it." The door jerked behind me as Emily tried to open it. "David." Her voice rose to a screech. The bearded man moved forward. I retreated to the door, hitting it with my back. "Run through the back door." I shouted without turning around. "Get to the car." The door flew open, and I flew inside, slamming it in the bearded man's face. The lock clicked. There was a bang outside as the tire iron crashed into a tree. Emily and Zack were already running through the kitchen to the back door. I ran after them, tripping over chairs. The back door led to a narrow path that wound through the trees to the lake. The car was on the left, but to get to it, you would have to cross an open space. "To the right," Zack whispered, pointing to the path. There's a boat. We dashed into the darkness. The wind tore at my clothes, and the rain blinded me. There was a crash from behind. The bearded man and his henchmen were breaking through the house. The boat, old and full of holes, was still tied to the pile. I pushed Zack into it, helped Emily get in. He jumped last, cutting the rope with a knife. We pushed off from the shore just at the moment when two men jumped out of the bushes. "Row!" I shouted, grabbing an oar. The boat creaked as it picked up speed. The bearded man stood on the shore, his figure disappearing into the rain. The thin man threw a stone at us and missed. "Where are we going?" Emily hugged Zack, her face wet with tears and rain. "To the other shore." I was paddling, feeling my muscles ache. There should be a road there. But the lake was wider than I remembered. Waves rocked the boat, water seeped through the cracks. Zack tried to scoop it out with an empty can he found under the seat. Half an hour later, we reached the opposite shore. We pulled the boat onto the sand and ran through the thicket. His feet sank into the mud, branches whipped at his face. I didn't know where we were running, just ahead, away from them. Emily stumbled and fell. I picked her up, feeling her body tremble. "Dad, look." Zack pointed ahead. A light could be seen through the trees, the window of a lonely house. We ran to him, hoping for help. The house was abandoned. The windows were broken, and the door was hanging on one hinge. There are traces of a long-ago fire inside, burnt furniture, blackened walls. "No," Emily sobbed. "Be quiet." I listened. Somewhere in the distance, an engine whined their car. They were looking for us. Zack found a rusty pipe in the corner and held it in his hands. I looked around the house. The back door led to an old dirt road overgrown with grass. "That way," I pointed. "Let's go before it gets completely dark." We walked for an hour, 2, 3. My legs were burning, and my clothes were stuck to my body. Emily began to lag behind, her breathing becoming hoarse. "Dad." Zack stopped. "Do you hear?" The hum of an engine filtered through the rain. They were getting closer. "Run." I pushed them into the bushes. "Hide." He stayed on the road, clutching the pipe. The headlights came around the bend, blinding me. The truck skidded to a stop a meter away, and a bearded man jumped out of the cab. "The games are over." He stepped forward. A knife flashed in his hand. I swung the pipe, but he deftly dodged, hit me in the stomach. The air rushed out of my lungs, and I fell to my knees. "Where are they?" He put the blade to his throat. Zack flew out of the bushes, hitting the bearded man on the back with a pipe. He growled and turned around, but I grabbed his leg, knocking him to the ground. A struggle ensued. Shot. Everyone froze. Emily was standing on the road, holding in her trembling hands an old revolver found in a burned-out house. Smoke was streaming from the trunk. The bearded man lay motionless, blood spreading across the wet ground. The thin man sitting in the truck took off, kicking up a fountain of mud. We watched in silence as the truck lights disappeared into the darkness. Then Emily dropped the gun and hugged Zack. "It's over," she whispered. But I knew it was just the beginning. They'll be back, or others will come. And we were still in the wilderness, far from help, with a corpse at our feet and a gun in our hands. The truck disappeared around the bend, leaving behind only the rumble of the engine, disappearing into the sound of rain. Emily was trembling, still clutching the revolver. Zack raised the tube, pointing it towards the darkness, as if expecting another attack. I went up to the bearded man's body, turned it over. The glass eyes stared at nothing, blood mixed with dirt. In his jacket pocket, I found a bunch of keys, crumpled dollars, and a battered notebook. "What's in there?" Emily approached, still holding her weapon. I opened my notebook. The pages were filled with dates, coordinates, and names. Laura, 34, red-haired. Michael, 12, freckles. Nearby are the amounts. 5,000. 5,000, 8,000. At the end of the list is our last name. They were selling people, I whispered. We were the next batch. Zack snatched the notebook from my hands, flipping through the pages. His face contorted in disgust. "There are more addresses here." He pointed to the notes in the corner. "Maybe these are their bases?" Emily grabbed my sleeve. "We need to go to the police. Now, the road is uphill." I pointed to a gap between the trees. "There may be a communications tower." We moved forward, leaving the body on the road. The rain continued unabated, soaking to the bone. After an hour of climbing, Zack tripped over a rock, spraining his ankle. Emily gritted her teeth and tore open the hem of her shirt to fix the bandage. "Dad, look." Zack pointed at the cliff ahead. At the top was a mast with an antenna. The tower was abandoned. The door to the technical booth was torn off its hinges, and inside there was trashed equipment and broken monitors. But there was a walkie-talkie on the floor. I tried to turn it on, and the light blinked yellow. Maybe it's working? Emily grabbed the microphone. Hello? Somebody. We need help. Just a crackle. Suddenly, a voice came from the speaker. I see you. We froze. Who's that? I tore out the microphone. Go away, they're everywhere. The voice disappeared. The radio hissed, then gave a clear signal. Someone's cold laughter. Hi, David, the man said. You killed my brother. Emily gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Who are you? I gripped the microphone until my knuckles turned white. You're in my forest. Here I decide who will leave. Pause. Do you want to save your family? Go back to the cabin. I'm waiting. The connection was interrupted. Zack cursed, hurling the jar at the wall. It's a trap, Emily whispered. He wants us to come back. We have no choice. I looked at the map from a notebook. If we leave, they'll find us. If we stay, we'll die of cold. We went back down to the lake, stealthily, like shadows. The boat was still on the shore. We rowed in silence, each immersed in his own thoughts. The light was on at the dock of the cabin. He wasn't there when we left. Emily swallowed. I got out first, knife ready. The door was open. In the living room, a man in a black raincoat was sitting on the sofa. Next to him is the thin one, the one who escaped. There was a laptop on the table and a live broadcast on the screen. Sit down, the man pointed to the chairs. We will come to a civilized agreement. Where's my son? Emily lunged forward, but I held her back. The thin man clicked the bolt of his pistol. Zack's safe. For now, the man smiled. You killed my brother. Now you owe me. What do you want? I whispered. You will replace him. Shoot a couple of scenes for me. He opened the suitcase. Inside there are video cameras, instruments, vials of medicines. Or you'll all die. Emily began to sob. Zack, pale, was staring at the gun. I felt the knife in my hand getting heavier. No, I said. The man nodded at the thin man. He raised his gun, pointing it at Emily. A click. Empty. At that moment, I jumped. The knife entered the man's throat. Warm blood splattered on the walls. The thin man dropped his weapon and rushed to the door, but Zack hit him on the head with a pipe. Silence. A message popped up on the laptop screen. The broadcast has begun. Carrie was lying on the grass, bloodied, with torn legs, arm and chest, the skin on which hung in rags, and bones sticking out of the wounds like white daggers. Her breathing was hoarse, ragged, and each breath was accompanied by the gurgling of blood in her throat, mixed with gasoline, which burned her wounds. The drone hovering above her illuminated her face with a bright spotlight, recording every detail: sweat, tears, blood flowing on the grass, and the charred edges of her skin where gasoline had already begun to act. Laughter came from the speaker, low, creepy, like those who enjoyed her suffering, mixed with whispers. Carrie? Carrie. Her eyes, filled with horror, followed the four figures surrounding her. Mark with an axe, a woman with a camera, a man with a gun, and a man with a shovel, whose faces were empty, covered with dirt and scars, like those who had long ceased to be human. A man with a gun, with short hair and scars on his arms, raised the barrel, aiming at Carrie's head, and fired. The bullet shattered her skull, the meat shattered, the bones cracked, and blood sprayed like a fountain, flooding the grass, the camera, and the faces of all three. Her brain, wet and red, fell out onto the ground, mixing with blood, and her eyes popped out of their sockets, remaining on stalks full of horror. The drone continued filming, bringing the camera closer to her shattered head, capturing every shard of bone, every piece of flesh, every drop of blood trickling down the grass. But it wasn't the end. Mark Tall, with broad shoulders and scars on his face, raised an axe and brought it down on her neck, severing her head with a crunch that echoed across the field. The meat exploded, the bones split, blood gushed out in a river, flooding the ground and Mark's hands. The skin sagged like a rag. Carrie's head fell. Her eyes were still open, full of agony. Her mouth was frozen in a silent scream, and blood was running down the grass, mixing with ash from gasoline. The woman with the camera laughed, recording how the flesh tore, how the bones fell out, how the skin charred from a fire that began to lick the body. A man with a shovel splashed gasoline on her remains, and the smell of fuel mixed with blood and dirt, causing nausea. He flicked the lighter, and the fire broke out, devouring Carrie's body, The skin cracked, the meat sizzled, the bones turned black, until only ashes and charred fragments remained. Flames licked at her face, charring what was left of her eyes, nose, and mouth, leaving only embers and smoke. A woman with a camera filmed how the fire devoured the field, how the grass hissed, as Carrie's bones smoldered, turning to dust, but they didn't stop. A man with an axe began to dismember her charred remains. He cut off her hand. The meat tore, the bone cracked, blood mixed with ashes splattered on the grass. The woman with the camera laughed, recording how the flesh tore, how the bones fell out, how the skin charred completely. The second man splashed more gasoline, intensifying the flames, and the fire engulfed the field, devouring everything: grass, trees, Carrie's remains. Her charred bones sizzled, her skin cracked, and the smell of burnt flesh mixed with smoke rising to the sky like a distress signal. The drone, still hovering, recorded how the flames devoured the field, and laughter came from a speaker. "Carrie is our number 9. The next act begins." They packed her charred remains into a suitcase, the same as the ones in a house, and attached a note written in blood: "Carrie, you are the star of our show." A helicopter hovering over the field lowered the rope, and they flew away, leaving the field on fire, smoke rising into the sky as a grim reminder. But the next day, someone found a suitcase in the woods. A girl with a backpack and a flashlight. She opened it, saw ashes, bones, blood, and her face turned pale. Inside was a new note written in blood: "You're next if you're watching." She dropped her suitcase and ran, but the drone hovering over her turned on the spotlight, and a voice from the speaker said, "Welcome to the game." The network, which watched everything through drones, cameras, and helicopters, continued to work, turning fear, blood, and death into a business show where every scream, every shot, and every murder were mounted and sold to those who paid for such terrifying moments. Carrie became part of their collection, but her death was not the last, and the field where she died became a new scene for their nightmare, where the next victim was already waiting in the wings. A week later, the police raided the cabin. They found 12 bodies, including mine. But they're still arguing in chat rooms. Some swear they saw a man with a scar on his face and a teenager in a black hoodie come out of the woods and get into a black SUV. They say they're heading north. They say they're still on the air.